Hello, I am Charlotte Perkins Gilman. I was born in July of 1860, but was not truly born until about the age of 15, when I realized that neither my mother nor anyone could make me do anything. One could suffer, one could die if it came to that, but no one could be coerced. Since then, I have always believed the one predominant duty in life is to find one's work and do it, and I have spent my life trying to reach as many people possible in hopes of reducing unnecessary human suffering. I am a writer and have written over 2,000 works in a wide range of genres. In 1935, I decided to take my own life in preference of chloroform over being eaten by cancer. Throughout my lifetime, strict gender roles and expectations have impacted my ideas. Young women were trained and groomed for marriage and family life, and young men worked. My parents were perfect examples of this ideal. But after the Civil War, there was a growing debate about the nature and place of women. My first love was a woman, Martha Luther, and I knew that was unacceptable. And when Martha got engaged, I was devastated. So I decided to follow my family's expectations and married Charles Stetson. I even had a daughter, but I got depressed. I associated marriage with a loss of agency, because that's exactly what it was. After nearing insanity at the recommendations of my male doctors, I realized the best treatment for my depression was to write instead of rest. This experience inspired my famous work, The Yellow Wallpaper. So I divorced Charles, who then married my cousin, and I even let them keep my daughter, which was unheard of at the time. I figured if I was going to be a writer and strive for women's equality, I might as well do it right by making some waves. My experience led me to evaluate marriage in a sociological context. I became a sociologist through my analysis of gender in society. Eventually, I remarried a man who understood equality in the home and was quite happy with him. My main focus as a sociologist has been on creating a ameliorative theory that reduces unnecessary human suffering. I believe this unnecessary human pain is the result of an unequal social relation of work, wrong thinking found in our collective culture, and excessive sex distinction to the detriment of the human race. Concerning the social relation of work, I believe since work is so necessary to sustaining human life, that the collective effort of production should be a natural source of happiness. Work should not only provide our livelihood, but also allow us to express ourselves. We should be allowed the opportunity to be economically independent. Sadly, what we tend to find is women are denied access to the collective effort of production, economic independence, and thereby the joys found in self-expressive work. My solution to this issue is to give women economic independence. Which brings us to collective culture. Work, which should be the source of humanity's greatest joy, is distorted in its interaction with culture. Our collective culture is essentially a composition of dominant societal beliefs. The sad part is that our collective culture is producing wrong thinking. One major cause of human pain is that people think wrongly about work, home, and children. The main wrong thinking that is perpetuated in our society is a male-centered experience. My solution to this issue is to restructure the home with fairness. Fairness exists when all people are able to participate fully in the interdependence of social life. That is, able to work and do mutual service in a way that both pleases the individual and promotes the good of society. Therefore, my solution to our collective culture issues is to correct our wrong thinking. My key explanation for wrong ideas in the social relation is excessive sex distinction, or what you may know is gender. The original purpose for sex distinction is based in evolution of our species. For instance, the colorful male bird uses beauty to attract a mate. When distinctions of sex are carried to such a degree to be disadvantageous to our progress as individuals and as a race, they are excessive. We have grown to a point in which men and women are seen much more for their differences than their similarities. Differ as we may in sex, we must remain alike in species, equal in race development, or else destruction will overtake us. My solution is to create a human-centered society instead of a male-centered society. The two most vital concepts in my work are the sexuo-economic relation and the androcentric culture, both of which are in relation to gender. The relationship between gender and work is the sexuo-economic relation. The sexuo-economic relation is a condition existing only among human beings in which one sex, the female, is economically dependent on the other sex, the male. We are the only animal species in which the female depends on the male for food, the only animal species in which the sex relation is also an economic relation. When a woman is taught that her main source of livelihood is dependent on finding an economically stable man to marry, then all of her efforts are put into being a desirable wife who can produce children and tend to domestic duties. Therefore, her work does not directly produce self-expression and joy or a paid wage. Her work becomes related to her sex and earns her a livelihood dependent on her husband. In her position of economic dependence in the sex relation, sex distinction is with her not only a means of attracting a mate, as with all other creatures, but as a means of getting her livelihood, as in the case with no other creature under heaven. If the only method of gaining economic security is to acquire and maintain a marriage, then marriage has been growing to be the accepted form or sex union of prostitution. We have accepted this prostitution and called it a social necessity. The relationship between gender and culture is the androcentric culture. We have a common consciousness as society, a system of concepts patterned not only by human understandings, but by masculine interests and experience. In other words, our culture is centered on the male experience of life versus a human experience of life. Due to our culture being one of the male experience, the female experience and influence is lessened to an incredible degree. This androcentric culture is detrimental to us as an entire race by limiting the growth and contribution of over half of our population. No doubt men have incredibly valuable contributions in our society, but what about the potential contributions of women in the public realm? When we have been confined to the home and taught to prostitute ourselves in marriage, we are not given much opportunity to grow and prosper as individuals, and therefore put effort into improving our society as a whole. All of our social institutions are shaped by our androcentric culture and the sexuo-economic relation. Being that women are rarely, if ever, accepted into powerful positions within our social institutions, they are all strictly shaped and influenced by the male perspective. I believe this diminishes every institution by excluding the valuable contributions that could be made by women. In this way, I focus mainly on the macro level of analysis, or how large-scale social structures impact large amounts of people. But I also believe that these large-scale issues of gender inequality affect us all on an individual level in our everyday lives, or the micro level of analysis. I also find similarities within my theory with that of Karl Marx. Marx believes that our collective culture is also distorted by an unequal social relation of work. I build on his ideas of the relationship between the oppressor and the oppressed, and both of us share a passion for equality. But where I think our main issue lies is in gender inequality, and Marx believes our main issue lies in class inequality. I tend to see myself aligning most closely with the typologies of interpretivism and idealism. As an interpretivist, I believe that reality is affected by lived human experience. Our life worlds are interpreted based upon our gender. It is quite obvious that the human experience of gender affects everything we encounter in life, or else natural selection would have made us more equal by natural laws. As an idealist, I believe our social superstructure creates our material resources. Our society is based in excessive sex distinction, which leads to material resources being acquired by the male and the female being dependent on the male for those material resources. If we change our ideas about sex distinction, our material resources will change in turn. I am reaching out to you from the past to show you that although our race has progressed substantially from my time, you are still participating in grossly excessive sex distinction, possibly without even knowing it. In my book, Women in Economics, I use the analogy of a woman's corset to illustrate my point. It is equally possible for a race, a nation, a class to become accustomed to the most disadvantageous conditions and fail to notice them. Put on a corset, even a loose one, on a vigorous man or woman who never wore one, and there is intense discomfort and a vivid consciousness thereof. But the person habitually wearing a corset does not feel the evils, because the nerves have become accustomed to these disagreeable sensations and no longer respond to them. In fact, the wearer becomes so used to the sensations that when they are removed with the corset, there is a distinct sense of loss and discomfort. The same is true today of women's use of fashion, makeup, and body shaming. Most of you engage in the ridiculous daily rituals of applying makeup, wearing fashionable clothing, and worrying about your figure. This is not an expression of freedom or something to celebrate. Not when you feel bare and sick without makeup or guilty for not being smaller. Much of what we call beauty in a woman is not human beauty at all, but a gross overdevelopment of certain points which appeal to males, such as tiny, weak statures which are smaller than himself. Natural selection would follow that both sexes would benefit from being strong, more equally sized, but the continued preference for selecting smaller, weaker females with which to mate has genetically stunted our growth as a species. This explains why body shaming is so prevalent today among women, pushing some women to an unhealthy lifestyle to maintain the socially desirable body type. A woman who is thin, beautiful, and sickly is preferred over a healthy, larger statured woman. The same is also true for men who reflect feminine characteristics. Smaller statured, thinner men are less preferred than larger statured, bulky men. Therefore, excessive sex distinctions still exist today in the form of fashion, makeup, and body concerns. Most of you embrace it and feel lost without it. Just as the accepted constraint of the corset literally harms health by moving the organs, the societal constraints on body type literally harm health by inducing stunted growth and eating disorders. Take off the restraints, throw away the corset, and breathe deeply. My concepts are incredibly useful in explaining and understanding the negative effects of gender inequality. I provide logical arguments for the necessity of restructuring our culture to be positive and fulfilling for both men and women. My theory is also useful in that it is understandable and available to a large amount of people. I provide valuable ideas to improve society, for instance, restructuring our social institutions to include male and female contributions. I admit my theory would be more useful if I fully addressed racism and classism. I address a very limited range of social problems by strictly focusing on gender. I think since you all have progressed a great deal in sociological study and observation since my time, you can improve on and build my theory. Adding an equality component for race and class, as well as other marginalized groups, would vastly strengthen my ideas. Thank you so much for listening today, and I hope you will use my ideas to improve the world, as that has been my goal throughout my entire career as a sociologist.